He says to me, 5 shillings. Well, I says to him, no, 10. I won't do it for less than 10 gov. Bodies don't come cheap these days. These, not the fresh ones.
Well, labour ain't cheap neither. Here, you have a go. Did you hear that?
A blooming peeler. Oh, this way! This way!
Come on! Come on!
Dracula.
Scenes such as this became familiar to millions of cinema goers the world over in the late 60s to early 70s as Hammer unleashed its unique brand of Gothic horror onto the big screen. Actors such as Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Oliver Reed breathed new life into the genre as Hammer captured the imagination of a public eager for the resurrection of macabre cinema. Join us as we enter the world of Hammer.
Before 1957, Hammer films were best known for their black and white thrillers and domestic comedies, usually drawn from BBC television and radio. Even one of their biggest successes, the science fiction classic The Quatermass Experiment, was drawn from the BBC television series of the same name.
I was an assistant director there and then a production manager for 9 or 10 years at Hammer, and then Hammer made the very successful science fiction film, Quatermass Experiment.
It wasn't until the company released their Technicolor remake, The Curse of Frankenstein, that the term Hammer Horror was born. Noted television actor Peter Cushing starred as the infamous Baron,
who experimented with the devil and was forever cursed,
and unknown actor Christopher Lee as his unfortunate creature. The film, directed by Terence Fisher and written by Jimmy Sangster, shocked the critics. For sadists only, crowed one. Among the half-dozen most repulsive films I have encountered, noted another. The public on both sides of the Atlantic loved it, and the ringing of cash registers ensured Hammer's path for the next 2 decades. Hammer's engaging managing director James Carreras and his partner Tony Hines knew they had struck gold and announced an ambitious program for 1958 which would include war films, thrillers, a sequel to Frankenstein, and an all-new, full-colour remake of Dracula. Jimmy Sangster was once again engaged to script the film, drawing inspiration directly from Bram Stoker's original novel rather than the previous films.
Before Dracula, I did Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was a success, so they said, let's make the next classic horror, Gothic horror thing, and that was Dracula. So they bought the book, they made it. The book was public domain. They gave me the book, I read it and wrote the script. There was a lot of changes between the novel and the script, mainly because of budget. We had very little money. Hammer had very little money in those days. I think they made the first Dracula for about 85,000 quid.
Terence Fisher was once again entrusted with the director chores, and shooting was scheduled to begin on the 11th of November 1957 at Bray Studios in Windsor. Peter Cushing, who had since starred in The Abominable Snowman for Hammer, took top billing as the intrepid Van Helsing, a man of science pitted against the supernatural horrors. Character actor Michael Gough played Arthur Holmwood, and John Van Eysen played Jonathan Harker, whose visit to Castle Dracula in the film's opening sequence acts as a catalyst for the events that follow. Melissa Stribling played Mina, with voluptuous Valerie Gaunt as the vampire woman and Carol Marsh as the unfortunate Lucy.
I came to get that part of Lucy in Dracula. I remember there'd been a bit of a dull patch going on in British films at the time, and somebody asked me if I would like to come out here and talk about a part in a film they were going to make. So I came out and saw, I think it might be Jimmy Sangster, I can't really remember. And I didn't know what I'd really come out to talk about. He said, we have a little part here. I don't know whether you'd be interested in doing it. And I said, oh, yes, love to do anything. And he said, all right, then we'll send you a contract. And that was all I knew about it. And it turned out to be 3 days' work.
To play the Count, there was only one choice, Christopher Lee. The London-born 6'4" actor was cast not only because of his height, it was his ability to mix pathos with menace that attracted James Carreras. The actor's innate nobility and dark, elegant looks made him a natural to recreate the Count. Publicizing the film, Lee talked about the loneliness of evil, a subtle quality he was to bring to the character.
I read the book and I decided, right, he's heroic, he's romantic, he's erotic, and he has immense intellectual and physical power. But above all, stillness.
From the moment he descended Bernard Robinson's staircase, Lee's aristocratic Count dispelled any lingering memories of Bela Lugosi and introduced a Count as charismatic and handsome as he was dangerous. Fisher deliberately emphasized the romance of the vampire myth and stressed the eroticism of the Count's attraction. Lee is first and foremost a sexual predator, a demon lover, whose power over the hapless Mina rests as much with her compliance as his irresistible will. Hammer's female victims would welcome the undead embrace, not resist it. Despite having a mere 13 lines, Lee dominates the film, but the elements of Hammer horror were already coming into play. Fisher's nonchalant direction, the splendid sets of Bernard Robinson, Jack Asher's foreboding camera work, and James Bernard's dramatic score. Peter Cushing proves a worthy adversary. Athletic and professional, he uses both his brain power as well as his energy to defeat the Count.
This is not Lucy, the sister you loved. It's only a shell, possessed and corrupted by the evil of Dracula.
And, of course, there are the stakings.
When I went to film Dracula, I was never allowed into the crypt scene, the scene where the coffins were and the crypts were. And Peter Cushing was very careful to keep me outside of the crypt and said to me, the smoke going to be puffed at you. And I remember very clearly him putting that lovely coat around me with the big brown collar, which you'll see in the film.
Never has the blood oozed quite as red as it does in Dracula.
And arises at night to
The critics were once again less than impressed. This film disgusts the mind and repels the senses, said the Daily Worker.
Secrets that protect their dead. Supernatural powers.
Hammer was not slow to exploit their newfound infamy, and more horrors followed. The Mummy, reuniting Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, The Revenge of Frankenstein, and The Man Who Could Cheat Death, all directed by Terence Fisher from scripts by Jimmy Sangster. He was hired again to write a script that would finally become Disciple of Dracula, but it wasn't until 1960 that Hammer returned to the vampire myth with The Brides of Dracula. Directed again by Terence Fisher, the script used elements of the earlier Sangster Dracula script. But despite the publicity team's promise of the most evil Dracula of all, Fisher's second vampire film didn't feature the Bram Stoker's Count at all. The original title, Disciple of Dracula, more accurately reflects the film. Lee was unavailable, so instead the film centred on an acolyte of the Count called Baron Meinster, played with boyish charm by David Peel. The story has French school teacher Marianne Danielle spending the night at an isolated castle. Ignoring the warnings, Danielle, played by Yvonne Monlaw, naively releases the evil Baron, setting him free to stalk the students at the local girls' school.
Who served the vampires with insane loyalty.
This simple plot device allowed Hammer to push the boundaries of good taste further than ever before. Monlaw was hailed by Hammer as France's latest sex kitten and was displayed in all her charm in a series of publicity shots. The actress went on to star in Terror of the Tongs for Hammer, as well as Circus of Horrors.
And one day my agent saw me in Women in Love. It's a TV, in English TV, and producer of Brides saw me on that TV, and they chose me. Maybe they think I was good on that part. In spite of my French accent, I was chosen to play on Brides. My first experience with Hammer.
Filling in for the Count was diminutive, unknown actor David Peel, who supplemented the usual vampire cloak with a pair of stacked shoes, an unusual choice to say the least. Peel was promoted as something of a teenage heartthrob, but his boyish good looks belied his 40 years of age. The press's description of the actor as a confirmed bachelor was recognized code that few needed spelled out.
David had a beautiful voice. His appearance was interesting because so different. The look was so different from Christopher Lee, but I think it gave a magnitude to his character, being blonde and handsome like he was.
Peter Cushing was reluctant to return as Van Helsing, but a Dracula movie without either the Count or his adversary was unthinkable, and the script was gradually whittled into an acceptable shape.
Peter Cushing was very energetic, yes, fighting all the time with David Peel. It was a dangerous sequence, but he was not shy to do that. And I remember, by the way, a sequence we had on a very high platform at the old mill. The old mill surrounded by flames, and we were obliged to stay there for a while. Marvelous actor.
Also in the cast was the venerable character actress Martita Hunt, playing Baroness Meinster, doomed by her own son. The cackling Frida Jackson, playing the family servant, creates one of the film's most memorable sequences at the birth of a fledgling bloodsucker. The result of their efforts is arguably the finest of Hammer's horror movies. It looks superb. Jack Asher's photography was never better. The acting is flawless and, script aside, it offers a lingering glimpse into a lush, erotic and chilling twilight world that Hammer would never quite recreate. The Brides of Dracula also shows Terence Fisher at the very height of his powers. Always hating the word horror, he preferred macabre. Fisher had settled happily for a late career in Hammer Gothics. Universal Pictures were particularly impressed with the film and immediately started negotiations for a new Dracula project, provisionally titled Dracula 3. Hammer, meanwhile, were busy recycling classic monsters into new Technicolor horrors, the likes of The Curse of the Werewolf, The Phantom of the Opera, and The Old Dark House, all flowed through Bray Studios, but the company did not allow the vampire to rest for long. It was left to Tony Hines, under the pseudonym of John Elder, to recycle the script of Dracula 3 into an altogether new project. Instead of Dracula, Elder introduces another offshoot of the vampire clan, Count Ravna, in Kiss of the Vampire. The story is simplicity itself. From his castle in the Bavarian Alps, Ravna spies the arrival of English newlyweds, the Harcourts, played by Edward de Souza and Jennifer Daniel. Jennifer Daniel had a muff, a huge muff, turn of the century clothes and everything, looking very pretty. And through this muff, I had to hold a piece of wire which was attached to a Victorian brass light switch which was on the dashboard. That was the ignition switch. And I had to surreptitiously under the muff pull this switch so that the engine died, and then we all got into trouble. No sooner have the couple settled into the honeymoon suite of the local inn than they are summoned to dinner with Ravna and his family. A masked ball preludes Mrs. Harcourt's abduction and later induction into the vampire cult. We had a scene in Kiss of the Vampire where she became a vampire, and there she was with her teeth, and she had to tear my shirt off, and this was her great mistake, you see, because with the blood that was pouring from the tear down my chest, I was able to make the sign of the cross, and that frightened the life out of her. But what I heard from the crew was that when she did this down my chest, they all said, "You know what, Edward, she enjoyed that." Elder now fashioned a vampire tale without Peter Cushing. Instead, he introduced the haunted Professor Zimmer, Clifford Evans, a man who seeks redemption at the bottom of a bottle, and who is not above using the black arts to fight his nemesis. Ravna is played with insidious charm by Noel Willman, who'd won a Tony Award in 1962 for directing A Man for All Seasons on Broadway. Elder also recycles many ideas jettisoned from earlier movies, including the climatic plague of bats descending, somewhat unconvincingly, from moonlit skies to destroy the cult.
A young couple in love, enjoying a romantic honeymoon, enjoying the pleasure of each other's company, knowing the sublime happiness of the kiss of love. But the kiss of love is a stranger here, where only evil is good, and the only kiss, the kiss of the vampire.
Stylishly directed by Australian Don Sharp, a new name to horror movies, who would nonetheless bring a pacing and style not generally associated with the genre. Sharp's horrors rely heavily on atmosphere and tension rather than shock effects, helped once again by the splendid sets of Bernard Robinson and James Bernard's evocative soundtrack. Filmed in the autumn of 1962, Kiss of the Vampire was not released in the UK until January 1964, where it was sent out on a double bill with the Hammer thriller Paranoiac. Everybody wanted to work for Hammer, and when I got Phantom of the Opera, everybody was very cross with me, indeed, because they all wanted to be in it, of course. But well, it wasn't for them; it was for me. And as I said, mercifully, the costumes still fitted me when I did because of the vampire, because it was set at the same time. Bray provided the location for the long-awaited return of Dracula in the 1965 film Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Christopher Lee was back as the Count, complete with the first appearance of the infamous red-lined cape. Lee had been tempted back to the role by a contract which guaranteed a second leading role as Rasputin, a film directed by Don Sharp and shot back-to-back with the Prince of Darkness using the same principal cast and sets. Economy rather than style was Tony Hines' watchword, and the two Lee films would form a quartet, with two minor horror films also shot back-to-back, The Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile. Dracula, Prince of Darkness opens with a reprise of the rousing climax of Dracula, a reminder of past glories and setting a standard that the new film would struggle to achieve. The story centres on a quartet of English tourists enjoying the late Count Dracula's hospitality when making an impromptu visit to Castle Dracula.
Sir? I'm afraid not. Is he indisposed?
He's dead.
Why should a dead man be interested in entertaining guests?
When one of their number, played by Charles Tingwell, is butchered by the manservant Clove, the bloodletting signals not only the Count's revival, but a new age in full-blooded violence for Hammer. Christopher Lee was reportedly unhappy with his dialogue, and the once majestic Count is rendered more or less mute, reduced to a series of snarls and hisses. Lee's screen presence is not diminished by the passage of the years, though his Count now has discreetly greying temples. If the actor's impact is lessened at all, it's by keeping audiences waiting nearly 50 minutes before his first appearance. Dracula is confronted by a rifle-touting monk played with gusto by Andrew Keir, one of Hammer's most reliable character actors. This was Fisher's last vampire film, and with Hammer hiring new and younger directors, his influence in the studio's output would gradually diminish over the next few years. The ever-reliable Thorley Walters played the simple-minded Ludwig, a character closely modelled on Bram Stoker's Renfield, one of a number of references lifted from the original novel. Francis Matthews, from The Revenge of Frankenstein, and Susan Farmer, from The Devil Ship Pirates and The Scarlet Blade, made up the quartet. The highlight of the film was arguably the transformation of the mousy Helen from repressed battle axe to sexual siren. The natural redhead Barbara Shelley was Helen. She recalled later that she played the part like a raging Greek fury.
But I have to say that, dear Barbara, there's a scene where I have to put a stake through her heart. And I decided that to take the curse off it, I would do it very ordinarily when the monk says, Domine non sum dignus. Domine non sum dignus. And I treated it like when they speak Latin, priests, it becomes very ordinary for them because they say it so often. So I take the stake, and I'm on this side of Barbara, and I say, Domine non sum dignus. She fell apart. You know, she lay on it. Just couldn't get the bloody shot.
Bernard Robinson recreated Castle Dracula, or at least its facade, on the Bray backlot, adding a frozen moat, utilised for the Count's imaginative watery demise, where veteran stuntman Eddie Powell risked life and limb on the artificial moat at Castle Dracula. Released as part of a double bill with The Plague of the Zombies, Dracula, Prince of Darkness proved there was still life in the character yet. Hammer would ensure that audiences were not kept waiting as long for the next installment. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave also marked the first of their vampire films to be shot away from Bray. James Carreras felt that they'd outgrown the little studio and had moved the company to a temporary base at Pinewood. It wasn't only the studio that was different. This was also the first Dracula not directed by Terence Fisher, who'd broken his leg in a road accident just prior to shooting. Oscar-winning cameraman Freddie Francis took the director's reins. Francis had impressed Carreras with his handling of the company's thrillers, their mini-Hitchcocks, Paranoiac, Nightmare and Hysteria. Francis had also made his first horror film for Hammer in 1964 with The Evil of Frankenstein, before moving to their main rivals, Amicus, for a series of films including the highly respected Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. A reluctant Christopher Lee agreed to reprise the title role, but the actor was becoming increasingly unhappy with Hammer's approach. Lee was particularly concerned with John Elder's revisionist script, including a sequence where the Count is staked in the traditional fashion, but a cowardly priest's inability to intone the Latin prayer means he can rise up and pull the stake from his own body.
Basically, of course, it's the stake through the heart and the head cut off. At least that's in the book, the head cut off. Basically, the stake through the heart. Well, I fought this. I must be fair in defense of myself there. I fought this and I said, I don't think this is right. You know, you'll destroy the legend or whatever you like to call it. And it doesn't seem right to me that he pulls it out. Incidentally, I got soaked.
Television actor Rupert Davis, best known as the detective Maigret, was drafted in as Monsignor Ernst Müller. It is the Monsignor's well-meaning but misguided exorcism of Castle Dracula in the film's opening sequence that drives the straightforward revenge plot. Revived from the frozen ice, the Count travels to Keinenburg, where he singles out the Monsignor's virginal niece Maria as a tasty target. Sensing a change in the demographics of their audience, Hammer would depend more and more on their juvenile leads, with Davis reduced to a peripheral character and Maria, played by newcomer Veronica Carlson, very much centre stage. Hailed as both Hammer's new star discovery and Dracula's most beautiful victim. The vampire hunting duties now passed to Barry Andrews, playing Maria's lover Paul, whose intervention finally leads to the Count's bloody demise. More traditional support was offered by a familiar face to Hammer fans, Michael Ripper, the Portsmouth-born actor who had a small part in The Brides of Dracula. By far the most prolific and versatile of Hammer's regular company, Ripper graced movies such as Camp on Blood Island, The Mummy, and Pirates of Blood River. This was the last vampire film involving Bernard Robinson, the production designer who died in 1970. Pinewood's more expansive sound stages allowed the designer to create the dreamlike rooftops of Keinenburg, eerily lit by Francis's imaginative use of filters. It was a fitting bow from the man whose work was so much part of the Hammer style. The previous year, James Carreras had submitted Hammer's name for the prestigious Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement. The company had estimated that nearly £2.7 million had been generated in export earnings in the previous 3 years, around 70% of Hammer's total profits. On the 29th of May 1968, Brigadier Sir Henry Floyd, Lord Lieutenant of Buckinghamshire, Hammer executives and staff, as well as Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, gathered on the set at Pinewood for the official ceremony.
When Hammer Films received the Queen's Award for Export, which I dare say some of you know about, for having brought very large sums of money into this country and considerably helped the economy, which they did, there's no question about it, in all parts of them, the award was given to us during the filming of this picture down at Pinewood. All of us were there, you know, all the Hammer people, the great team, like Jack Asher, the cameraman, and Bernie Robinson, the art director, who is alas dead, and Tony Nelson Keyes, producer of many of them, Terence Fisher, of course, naturally. All the men who had really done the job, the people who were responsible for Hammer's success.
By the time the film went on national release in England, the next Dracula movie had been announced.
Dracula has risen from the grave.
Taste the Blood of Dracula started out as a Dracula movie without Dracula. Christopher Lee felt he had, in his own words, discharged any obligations to the company. The actor instructed his agent that he would not be appearing in any future Hammer Dracula film unless they guaranteed him a percentage of the American gross. Unperturbed by the loss of their star, James Carreras announced what would be the greatest Dracula of them all. Tony Hines, writing as always as John Elder, introduced audiences to Lord Courtly, a depraved English aristocrat whose predilections for the dark side were intended to dispel any memories of Dracula. 29-year-old Ralph Bates, making the first of 5 films for Hammer, was engaged to play the role. Bates, who had been spotted playing Caligula in the television series The Caesars, would also be groomed as likely successor to Peter Cushing's Baron Frankenstein. Hammer may have managed perfectly well without the Count in Brides of Dracula, but Warner Brothers' Seven Arts were less than happy when the news arrived. James Carreras was reminded that the American studio had the right of veto over the leading players, and they were not interested in anyone playing Dracula except Christopher Lee. Producer Ada Young was given the task of persuading the reluctant star to take up, once again, the cape and contact lenses. Eventually, Lee reversed his earlier decision, but not with the good grace one might have expected. In a note to his official fan club, Lee noted that, "On November the 3rd, I start what I hope will positively be my last Hammer film." He went on to say, "As usual, words fail me, as indeed they will also do in the film." This last-minute change of heart left the filmmakers with little time to rewrite the script. Hines had to simply shoehorn the character into the action, and Lee's Count remains a peripheral figure lurking in the shadows. Taste the Blood of Dracula opens with the climax of Dracula has risen from the grave, and Dracula's gruesome demise witnessed by the opportunistic Weller, Roy Kinnear. Weller then gathers Dracula's ashes for future profit.
This way, gentlemen. We know the way.
The action shifts to London, where 3 very proper Victorian gentlemen use their cloak of respectability to cover their sordid, nocturnal prowling. Enticed by Lord Courtly, the 3 men participate in a revolting black magic ceremony which leaves Courtly dead and frees Dracula to roam London in search of revenge. Hammer assembled a strong cast, including Geoffrey Keane, Peter Sallis, and John Carson in the central roles. Martin Jarvis had been offered the romantic lead Paul, but declined due to theatrical commitments. He was free, however, to take on the smaller role of Jeremy. The lead went to Anthony Collin, with Isla Blair and Linda Hayden providing the love interest. Solid support was provided by veteran actors Russell Hunter,
Ready when you are, gentlemen.
And, of course, Michael Ripper, cast this time as the police officer trailing in the wake of Dracula's vengeance.
We're working with people like Michael Ripper, who's the quintessential innkeeper.
Michael Ripper, I believe, has made more Hammer films than any other actor on earth. And as Hammer films no longer exist, he will hold that record forever.
To direct the film, Carreras hired Peter Sasdy, a Hungarian immigrant. By the time he came to Hammer's attention, he had over 100 television shows to his credit. The scenes involving Victorian sexual hypocrisy were undoubtedly the highlights of the film. With Christopher Lee's earlier misgivings proving well-founded, Dracula becomes a shadowy peripheral figure, reduced to counting off his victims one by one. The mature approach was slightly at odds with the film's marketing in the UK, where the tagline became "Drink a pint of blood a day," an unsubtle play on the milk marketing board's well-publicised slogan, "Drink a pint of milk a day." Released on a bill with Hammer's thriller Crescendo, the film was successful enough to ensure that a sequel was pushed into preparation.